What would you do if the person you love most was torn from your arms by ruthless men who see human lives as mere merchandise? In 1829, in the unforgiving wilderness of the American Southwest, one Apache woman answered that question with deadly precision and unwavering courage. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss incredible stories like this one that showcase the extraordinary power of human determination. The morning mist clung to the canyon walls like the breath of ancient spirits, and Ayana moved through it with the silence that only her people possessed. Her bare feet found purchase on stones worn smooth by countless seasons, each step calculated, each movement a testament to generations of Apache wisdom flowing through her veins. At 19, Ayana was already known among her band as Tse-nah-es-tizhn, Eagle Eye, for her supernatural accuracy with the sling that never left her side. The weapon was deceptively simple, braided sinew and leather, worn smooth by her calloused hands, capable of sending a stone through a rabbit's eye at 50 paces. She had crafted it herself at the age of 12, following the ancient patterns taught by her grandmother, who had learned from her grandmother before her. The leather came from a deer she had hunted alone, the sinew from its tendons, prepared with sacred songs and blessed with corn pollen under the full moon. But this morning, as she gathered medicinal herbs in the pre-dawn darkness, her mind wasn't on hunting small game. It was on Quana, her husband of 2 summers, who should have returned from his scouting mission 3 days ago. The worry gnawed at her like a physical pain, growing stronger with each passing hour. Quana was never late. He was methodical, careful, always mindful of the dangers that lurked beyond their hidden canyon home. Quana wasn't Apache by birth. He was one of the Inde-Bikai, the dark-skinned ones who had escaped the white man's plantations and found refuge among her people. His back bore the scars of whips and chains, raised welts that told the story of years spent in bondage, but his spirit had never been broken. When he'd stumbled into their camp 2 years ago, more dead than alive, Ayana had seen something in his eyes that called to her soul. A fierce intelligence, an unquenchable thirst for freedom, and a gentleness that had somehow survived the brutality of his former life. The courtship had been unconventional. Apache tradition required elaborate negotiations between families, exchanges of gifts, demonstrations of worthiness. But Quana had no family to speak for him, no horses or weapons to offer as bride price. What he had was knowledge, intimate understanding of the white man's ways, their weaknesses, their blind spots. He had taught the band how to avoid the slave hunters who increasingly prowled their territory, how to read the signs of approaching danger, how to disappear into the landscape when soldiers came looking for hostile Indians. "The forest speaks of strangers," came a voice behind her. Ayana turned to see her grandfather, Nalnish, emerging from the shadows like smoke given form. At 73, the old warrior moved with the fluid grace of a man half his age, his weathered face a map of countless battles and hard-won wisdom. His eyes, still sharp as obsidian blades, held the accumulated knowledge of 7 decades spent reading the subtle language of the desert. Nalnish had been skeptical of Quana at first, as was proper for a grandfather protecting his granddaughter. But the escaped slave had proven himself in the Apache way, not with words, but with actions. He had saved 3 children from a flash flood, tracked down raiders who had stolen horses, and once fought off a mountain lion with nothing but a knife and his bare hands. More importantly, he had made Ayana happy in a way that lit up her entire being, like sunrise over the mountains. "What does it tell you, Shichei?" she asked, using the Apache word for grandfather. Nalnish's dark eyes scanned the tree line, reading signs invisible to untrained eyes. 6 men, white men. They move like hunters, but they hunt something more valuable than deer. His gaze settled on her face, and she saw the gravity there, the weight of terrible knowledge. They hunt people, granddaughter, and they have taken someone precious to you." The words hit Ayana like a physical blow. Her hand instinctively went to the medicine pouch at her waist, where she kept the small, carved eagle that Quana had made for her on their wedding day. He had spent weeks working on it in secret, using a piece of sacred turquoise traded from the Pueblo people, carving it with infinite patience and love. The eagle was her spirit animal, he had told her, because, like the great bird, she could see everything from above and strike with deadly precision. "How do you know?" she whispered, though part of her already understood. Nalnish had been reading signs since before she was born. If he said Quana had been taken, then it was true. "Because I found this." Nalnish held up a strip of blue cloth, torn and stained with blood. Ayana recognized it immediately. It was from the shirt she had sewn for Quana, dyed with indigo, traded from Mexican merchants. She had embroidered it with protective symbols, tiny eagles and lightning bolts worked in silver thread, believing they would keep him safe from harm. The world seemed to tilt around her. The morning bird song faded to a dull roar in her ears, and for a moment she felt as though she might collapse. The herbs in her gathering basket scattered as her hands began to shake. But then something deeper and more primal took hold, something that had been passed down through generations of Apache women who had fought to protect what they loved. Her great-grandmother had been a warrior woman, one of the legendary fighters who had held off Mexican soldiers for 3 days while the band escaped to safety. Her grandmother had killed 2 Comanche raiders with a war club when they tried to steal children from the camp. The blood of fighters flowed in her veins, and now it was calling to her, demanding action, demanding justice. "Which direction?" she asked, her voice steady as granite, despite the storm raging inside her. Nalnish pointed southeast, toward the broken country where the desert met the mountains. "They move toward the settlements, toward the slave markets. They have perhaps a day's lead, but they travel slowly, burdened by their captive and overconfident in their safety." Ayana closed her eyes and felt the rage building inside her like a storm gathering strength. These men, these Indar who saw human beings as property, had made a fatal mistake. They had taken her heart, her soul, her reason for breathing, and now they would learn what it meant to be hunted by an Apache woman with nothing left to lose. The transformation was almost physical. The frightened young wife was disappearing, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. This was what her people called ghost face, the expression that came over Apache warriors when they prepared for battle, when they stepped outside the normal world of human emotion and became instruments of pure purpose. "I need supplies," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that made even Nalnish step back slightly. "Ayana, no." Nalnish gripped her shoulder with surprising strength. "There are 6 of them, armed men, experienced killers. Slave hunters are not ordinary bandits. They are professionals who have survived by being more ruthless than their prey. You cannot—" "I can." She met his eyes, and he saw something there that made him step back. It was the look of a predator, cold and calculating and absolutely certain. "They think they know this land, Shiche. They think they understand what they're dealing with, but they're wrong. This is Apache country. This is my country, and I'm going to show them the difference between hunting animals and hunting the wind itself." Nalnish studied her face for a long moment, seeing not just his granddaughter, but the spirit of every Apache woman who had ever fought to protect her family. He saw his own wife, dead these 20 years, who had once held off a cavalry patrol single-handedly while he evacuated the wounded. He saw the fierce pride of a people who had never been conquered, never been broken, never learned to accept defeat. Finally, he nodded, understanding that this was bigger than one woman's quest for vengeance. This was about the survival of their way of life, about sending a message that would echo across the territory. Apache people were not prey to be hunted and sold. "What do you need?" "My sling, my stones, water for 3 days." and your blessing." Udri, the old warrior, reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a small pouch of yellow pollen, sacred corn pollen used in Apache ceremonies. He sprinkled it over her head while speaking in the old language, words of protection and strength that had been spoken over Apache warriors for countless generations. The ancient syllables seemed to hang in the air like visible things, wrapping around her like armor. "Usan go with you, granddaughter. May your aim be true and your heart be strong. May the spirits of our ancestors guide your stones to their targets, and may you return to us with honor." As the sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Ayana set out on the trail of her husband's captors. She moved like a ghost through the mesquite and palo verde, following sign that would have been invisible to white eyes. A broken twig here, a disturbed stone there, the faint impression of a boot heel in sandy soil. The men she pursued were confident in their superiority, careless in their passage through what they saw as empty wilderness. They left a trail that spoke of arrogance and contempt, trampled vegetation, carelessly discarded food scraps, the ashes of fires built too large and too bright. They had no idea that every step they took was being catalogued, every rest stop noted, every weakness observed by eyes that had been trained since childhood to read the language of the land. By midday, she had closed the distance considerably. From a ridge overlooking a narrow canyon, she could see them, 6 men on horseback, their captive bound and walking behind the last horse. Even at this distance, she could see that it was Quana, his proud shoulders bowed but not broken, his step still steady despite whatever torments they had inflicted upon him. The sight of him alive sent a surge of relief through her, followed immediately by a cold, calculating fury. These men had made their choice when they decided to traffic in human misery. Now she would make hers. Ayana settled into the rocks to observe and plan. The men were well armed, rifles, pistols, knives, but they were also overconfident. They rode bunched together, talking and laughing, paying little attention to their surroundings. They had no outriders, no rear guard. They were hunters who had never considered that they might become the hunted. As the afternoon wore on, she studied each man individually, noting their habits, their weapons, their positions in the group. The leader was a tall, bearded man who rode at the front, constantly scanning the horizon, but never looking up at the ridges where real danger might lurk. Behind him rode a younger man, nervous and twitchy, his hand never far from his pistol. The others were a mix of hardened frontiersmen and desperate men looking for easy money. But it was the way they treated Quana that sealed their fate in her mind. She watched them kick him when he stumbled, laugh when he fell, deny him water under the blazing sun. Each cruelty was noted, catalogued, and added to the debt they would pay. They had reduced her husband to an object, a commodity to be transported and sold. In doing so, they had forfeited any claim to mercy or compassion. As evening approached, and the men made camp in a small clearing beside a seasonal stream, Ayana began her descent. She moved like water flowing downhill, silent and inevitable, her sling already loaded with the first of the stones she had selected with deadly care. The hunt was about to begin. The desert night wrapped around Ayana like a familiar embrace as she positioned herself in the rocks above the slavers' camp. Below, the 6 men had settled into what they believed was a secure position. Backs to a cliff face, clear sightlines in 3 directions, and a small fire that would reveal any approaching threat. They had made only one mistake. They had never faced an Apache warrior who could kill silently from the shadows. The camp itself told a story of casual brutality and professional efficiency. The men had arranged their bedrolls in a defensive semicircle, weapons within easy reach, horses picketed where they could be mounted quickly if needed. It was the setup of experienced manhunters, men who had done this many times before and survived by being prepared for trouble. But their preparation was based on fighting other men, armed opponents who would announce their presence with gunfire and war cries. They had no defense against a predator who could strike from the darkness without warning, who could kill with weapons they would never see coming. Quana sat bound to a cottonwood tree at the edge of the firelight, his head hanging forward in exhaustion. But Ayana could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes occasionally flicked toward the darkness beyond the fire. He knew she would come. He was waiting, preparing himself for whatever opportunity might present itself. The ropes that bound him were thick and well tied, but Ayana noticed that his captors had made a crucial error. They had tied his hands in front of his body rather than behind, probably to make it easier to force him to walk during the day. It was a small mistake, but one that could prove fatal to them when the time came. The leader, who the others called Morrison, stood guard while his companions settled in for the night. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to intimidating others through size and reputation alone. His rifle rested casually in the crook of his arm as he scanned the darkness, seeing nothing but empty desert. Morrison had the look of a former soldier, his posture, the way he held his weapon, the methodical way he checked the perimeter. Probably a veteran of the Mexican War, Ayana thought, one of the thousands of men who had learned to kill in uniform and then brought those skills to the frontier when the fighting ended. Such men were often the most dangerous because they combined military training with the ruthlessness of civilian life. "Relax, Morrison," called one of the men from beside the fire. "Ain't nothing out there but coyotes and lizards. That Buck's people don't even know he's gone yet." The speaker was a thin, nervous man with darting eyes and hands that never stayed still. Ayana had already marked him as her first target, not because he was the most dangerous, but because he was the most likely to panic and raise an alarm if he spotted her. His name was Briggs, and he had the look of a man who had never been in a real fight, who relied on numbers and superior firepower to overcome his enemies. Morrison spat into the dirt, a gesture of contempt that spoke volumes about his opinion of his companions. "That's the kind of thinking that gets men killed, Briggs. Apache can track a shadow across solid rock. We don't let our guard down until we're back in civilization." "You worry too much," laughed another man, a thin, weaselly fellow named Carver. "What's one squaw gonna do against 6 armed men? Throw rocks at us." The irony of his words would have been amusing if the situation weren't so deadly serious. Carver was cleaning his pistol with the methodical care of a professional killer, but his casual racism blinded him to the real danger he faced. Like many white men on the frontier, he saw Apache women as helpless victims, incapable of real violence. It was a mistake that would cost him his life. Ayana selected her first stone, a smooth river rock the size of a hen's egg, perfectly balanced and heavy enough to crush a man's skull. She had gathered it from a sacred stream near her village, where the water spirits were said to bless weapons used in righteous combat. She fitted it into the leather cup of her sling and began the slow, rhythmic motion that would build the momentum needed for a killing blow. The technique had been passed down through generations of Apache warriors. The sling was not just a weapon, but an extension of the warrior's will, a tool that required perfect harmony between mind, body, and spirit. Ayana had practiced with it every day since childhood, developing the muscle memory and mental discipline needed to place a stone exactly where she wanted it, even in the heat of battle. Her target was the nervous young man who sat slightly apart from the others, constantly fidgeting with his weapons. He was the most likely to panic and raise an alarm if he spotted her, making him the logical first choice. More importantly, he sat in a position where his body would fall into the shadows beyond the firelight, buying her precious seconds before the others realized what had happened. The young man, she had heard them call him Peters, was barely out of his teens, with the soft look of someone who had never known real hardship. He was probably the son of a farmer or shopkeeper, drawn to the frontier by stories of easy money and adventure. Now he sat by the fire, trying to look tough while his hands shook slightly as he cleaned his rifle. Ayana closed her eyes and felt for the wind. Barely a whisper from the southwest, not enough to affect her aim significantly. She opened her eyes and focused on the target, visualizing the stone's path through the air, calculating angle and velocity with the instinctive precision that had made her legendary among her people. The mathematics of death were simple but unforgiving. The stone would travel in a perfect arc, its trajectory determined by the angle of release, the force applied, and the pull of gravity. At the moment of impact, it would be moving fast enough to shatter bone and pulp brain tissue, killing instantly and silently. Peters raised a cup of coffee to his lips, the tin cup catching the firelight as it moved. It was the moment she had been waiting for. His head was tilted back slightly, exposing the vulnerable point at the base of his skull where the spine met the brain. Ayana released. The stone flew through the darkness like a messenger of death, invisible and silent, until it struck Peters just behind his left ear with a sound like a melon dropping on stone. He pitched forward without a sound, the coffee cup falling from nerveless fingers to shatter on the rocky ground. "Peters!" Morrison called softly. "You all right over there?" When there was no response, Morrison took a step toward the fallen man, rifle coming up to a ready position. But Peters had fallen into the deep shadows beyond the fire's reach, and from Morrison's angle, it looked like the young man had simply laid down to sleep. "Lazy bastard," muttered Briggs, "probably passed out drunk." The casual dismissal bought Ayana precious time. She was already moving, flowing like smoke through the rocks to a new position. Her second stone was ready, and her next target was Carver, the thin man who had joked about Apache women throwing rocks. She would show him exactly how deadly those rocks could be. Carver sat with his back to a large boulder, cleaning his pistol with the methodical care of a professional killer. His position was more challenging. He faced partially toward her hiding place, and his body was angled in such a way that a clean headshot would be difficult. But Ayana had been hunting with a sling since she was old enough to walk, and she had learned long ago that there was more than one way to kill a man. She aimed for his throat, where the great vessels carried blood to the brain. It was a smaller target than the skull, but the results would be just as fatal. The stone would crush his windpipe and sever the arteries on either side of his neck, causing him to bleed out in seconds. The second stone struck Carver in the larynx with surgical precision, crushing his windpipe and severing the arteries on either side of his neck. He dropped his pistol and clutched at his throat, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he tried to scream through his ruined voice box. Blood poured between his fingers, black in the firelight, as his body went into shock from the massive trauma. This time, his death throes were impossible to ignore. "What the hell?" Morrison spun toward Carver, just as the wounded man toppled sideways, still clawing at his throat in his final moments. "We're under attack!" shouted Briggs, grabbing for his rifle. "Indians! Indians in the rocks!" The camp erupted into chaos. The three remaining men scrambled for cover, weapons raised, eyes searching the darkness for targets that weren't there. Morrison barked orders, trying to establish a defensive perimeter, but his men were panicking, firing blindly into the night at shadows and phantoms. The sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, a thunderous cacophony that would be heard for miles. But there was no one to hear it except the desert creatures, who fled deeper into their burrows and hiding places. The slavers were alone with their fear and their growing realization that they were being hunted by something beyond their understanding. "Where are they?" screamed the fourth man, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins. "I can't see anything." "Shut up and listen," Morrison hissed, but it was too late for stealth. The damage was done, and Ayana had already moved again. From her new position, she could see Quana clearly. Her husband had managed to work his bonds loose enough to slip one hand free, and he was using the distraction to untie himself completely. Their eyes met across the firelit clearing, and she saw him mouth a single word. Ready. The sight of him preparing to join the fight filled her with fierce pride. This was what she had fallen in love with. Not just his gentleness and intelligence, but his courage, his refusal to remain a victim even when the odds were hopeless. Together, they would show these slavers what it meant to hunt Apache people. Ayana nodded and selected her third stone. This one was smaller, sharper, a piece of flint napped to a razor edge. It wasn't meant to kill quickly. It was meant to wound, to cause pain and confusion, to further demoralize men who were already beginning to understand that they were being hunted by something beyond their comprehension. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. Morrison and Wade crouched against the cliff face like cornered animals. Their confidence shattered along with their companions' skulls. The desert around them had become a hostile entity, every rock a potential hiding place, every shadow a possible death. The psychological warfare was working exactly as Ayana had intended. These men had built their reputations on being the hunters, the predators who struck fear into the hearts of their victims. Now they were experiencing terror from the other side, and their minds were beginning to crack under the pressure. Hawkins lay moaning in the dirt, clutching his ruined shoulder where Ayana's flint-edged stone had torn through muscle and tendon like a knife. The wound was deliberately crippling rather than fatal. She wanted him alive to spread the story of what had happened here. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and viscous in the firelight, and his face was pale with shock and blood loss. "Jesus Christ," he whispered through gritted teeth. "What kind of devil are we dealing with?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. These were men who had seen violence in all its forms: war, murder, the casual brutality of the frontier. But this was different. This was surgical, precise, almost supernatural in its efficiency. They were being dismantled piece by piece by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't even comprehend. Quana had freed himself completely now and melted into the darkness beyond the firelight. Ayana caught a glimpse of him moving through the mesquite, circling around to cut off any escape route the surviving slavers might attempt. Her husband was unarmed, but he was Apache trained now, and in this terrain, that made him as dangerous as any weapon. Morrison's hands shook as he reloaded his rifle, the metallic clicks unnaturally loud in the desert silence. The big man's military training was warring with his growing panic, discipline fighting against the primal fear that was eating away at his composure like acid. "Wade," he whispered, "we're going to move. On my count, we run for the horses. Don't stop, don't look back, just run." Wade was a stocky, bearded man who had survived a dozen Indian fights and twice as many barroom brawls, but now his hands trembled as he checked his weapons, and his eyes darted constantly toward the rocks where death might be lurking. The casual confidence that had carried him through years of violence was gone, replaced by the desperate fear of a man who finally understood that he was outmatched. "What about the money?" Wade's voice was barely audible. "Morrison, that buck's worth $500 in Santa Fe. We can't just forget the money." Morrison's composure finally cracked. "Look around you, Wade. 4 men are dead, killed by rocks, by a woman with a sling. You want to end up like Carver, choking on your own blood?" The reminder of their companion's fate sent a fresh wave of terror through both men. They had seen death before, but never like this. Never so sudden, so silent, so utterly without warning. It was as if the desert itself had turned against them, using the very stones beneath their feet as weapons. Wade looked at the bodies scattered around the camp. Peters slumped in the shadows, Carver's throat torn open. Briggs sprawled beside the fire, Hawkins moaning softly as he bled out from his shoulder wound. The sight broke something inside him, some fundamental belief in his own invincibility that had carried him through years of violence. "Jesus," he whispered, "Jesus Christ, what kind of devil are we dealing with?" From the rocks above, Ayana heard every word. She had positioned herself where she could observe both men clearly, her fifth stone already seated in her sling. These men spoke of her husband as merchandise, as a commodity to be bought and sold. They had reduced a human being to a dollar amount, and that callousness sealed their fate more surely than any crime they might have committed. The stone she held was special, a piece of sacred obsidian from the holy mountain where her people went to seek visions. It was sharp enough to cut flesh, hard enough to shatter bone, and blessed by the spirits of her ancestors. If this was to be her final throw, it would carry with it the power of generations. But she wasn't finished with them yet. Fear was a weapon too, and she intended to use it to its fullest extent. These men needed to understand not just that they were going to die, but why. They needed to comprehend the magnitude of their transgression, the cosmic justice that was about to be visited upon them. Moving with the fluid silence that was her birthright, Ayana shifted position again, this time to a spot directly above the two survivors. She selected a small stone, not meant to kill, but to announce her presence. She wanted them to know exactly where death was coming from. The stone struck the cliff face just inches from Morrison's head, sending chips of rock cascading down onto his shoulders. Both men spun toward the sound, rifles raised, but they saw nothing except empty darkness. "She's right above us," Wade breathed. "Morrison, she's right above us." The knowledge that their killer was so close, so perfectly positioned, sent a fresh wave of terror through both men. They pressed themselves against the cliff face, trying to make themselves smaller targets, but there was nowhere to hide. They were trapped in a killing ground of Ayana's choosing, and she was picking them apart with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. "I know." Morrison's voice was steady now, the voice of a man who had accepted his own death and found a strange peace in that acceptance. "Wade, listen to me. When I give the word, you run for the horses. Don't worry about me, just run. I ain't leaving you, Morrison. We've been partners for—" "You're leaving." Morrison's tone brooked no argument. "One of us needs to get out of here alive. One of us needs to warn the others about what's out here." Ayana almost smiled at that. Let them warn whoever they wanted. Let word spread through every slave-hunting gang from Texas to California that there was an Apache woman in these mountains who would kill anyone who trafficked in human misery. Let them know that some things were sacred, and that violating those sacred things carried a price that would be paid in blood. The psychological effect would be devastating. Already she could imagine the stories spreading through the settlements. Tales of the Apache witch who could kill with stones, who moved like smoke through the desert, who turned hunters into prey. Some would dismiss the stories as frontier superstition, but others would remember and think twice before venturing into Apache territory. She selected her sixth stone, larger than the others, heavy enough to crush bone. This one was for Morrison, the leader, the man who had organized this expedition into hell. She would save Wade for last, let him run if he could, let him carry the story back to whatever hole he had crawled out of. Morrison must have sensed what was coming. He stood up slowly, rifle in his hands, and looked directly up at the rocks where she was hidden. The gesture took considerable courage. He was making himself a perfect target, but he was also asserting his humanity in the face of death. "I know you're up there," he called out. "I know you can hear me. That man we took, he's your husband, isn't he?" Ayana said nothing, but her grip tightened on her sling. The question revealed more than Morrison probably intended. It showed that he understood this wasn't just about money or territory or racial hatred. This was personal. This was about love and family and the bonds that held human beings together. "I got children," Morrison continued, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Two little girls back in Missouri. Their mama died of the fever last winter, and I've been trying to make enough money to send them to their aunt in St. Louis. I know that don't excuse what I done, but I want you to know I ain't just some monster. I'm just a man trying to take care of his family." The words hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. For a moment, Ayana felt something twist inside her chest. Not sympathy exactly, but a recognition of the complexity of human motivation. This man had children who loved him, who depended on him. His death would leave them orphaned and alone. But then she thought of Quana, bound and beaten, forced to march through the desert like an animal. She thought of all the other men and women who had been torn from their families by people like Morrison, sold into lives of misery and degradation. She thought of the children who would never see their parents again because of the choices this man had made. Morrison's personal tragedy didn't excuse his crimes. If anything, it made them worse. He knew what it was like to lose family, to feel helpless and desperate, yet he had chosen to inflict that same pain on others, to profit from the destruction of families like his own. "Your children will be orphans," she called back in English, her voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "But they will be free orphans. The people you hunt will never see their children again." Morrison closed his eyes, understanding that there would be no mercy, no reprieve. "I figured you might see it that way." "Run, Wade," he said quietly. "Run now." Wade didn't need to be told twice. He bolted from cover like a rabbit flushed from its burrow, sprinting toward the horses with desperate speed. Morrison raised his rifle toward the rocks, not really aiming, just making noise to cover his partner's escape. The gesture was almost admirable in its futility. Morrison knew he was going to die, but he was still trying to save his companion. It spoke to a code of loyalty that transcended their criminal activities, a brotherhood forged in violence but tempered by genuine affection. Ayana let Wade go. Her stone took Morrison in the center of his forehead, dropping him instantly. The big man fell backward against the cliff face and slid slowly to the ground, his rifle clattering on the rocks. In the sudden silence that followed, she could hear Wade crashing through the brush, heading for the horses. She could have killed him easily. He was running in a straight line, silhouetted against the stars, but she had made her choice. One would die. One would live to carry the message. Quana emerged from the shadows, moving to check on the fallen men. Hawkins was still alive, but unconscious from blood loss. He would live, but his arm would never be the same. The others were beyond help. "It's finished," Quana said softly. Ayana climbed down from the rocks, her legs suddenly shaky with exhaustion and reaction. The rage that had sustained her through the night was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache and the weight of what she had done. 5 men were dead by her hand, and while justice had been served, the cost was heavy. Quana caught her as she stumbled, pulling her against his chest. She could feel his heart beating strong and steady, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to believe that it was really over. "Are you hurt?" she whispered against his shoulder. "Nothing that won't heal." His hands stroked her hair, her back, reassuring himself that she was real and whole. "Ayana, what you did tonight. I have never seen anything like it. 5 men killed with stones, it's impossible." "Not impossible," she said. "Just Apache." They stood together in the dying firelight, surrounded by the evidence of her deadly work. In the distance, they could hear Wade's horse galloping away into the night, carrying news of the Apache woman who had turned the hunters into the hunted. But there was still one more chapter to this story, one more reckoning to be faced. 3 days later, Ayana and Quana sat on a ridge overlooking their band's camp, watching the smoke from cooking fires rise into the clear morning air. Below them, Children played among the wickiups while women worked, and men prepared for the day's hunt. It was a scene of peaceful normalcy that seemed almost surreal after the violence of the past week. The journey home had been a time of healing and reflection. Quana's wounds were superficial, bruises and cuts that would fade with time, but the psychological scars ran deeper. He had been forced to confront his worst nightmare, the possibility of being dragged back into slavery, and the experience had shaken him more than he cared to admit. For Ayana, the return journey had been a time of coming to terms with what she had become. She had killed 5 men in a single night, and while she felt no guilt about their deaths, she understood that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer just a young Apache woman with a talent for hunting. She was a warrior, a killer, a force of nature that had been unleashed upon the world. Quana's wounds were healing well. The slavers had beaten him, but hadn't broken any bones, and the desert sun had already begun to fade the bruises on his face. More importantly, the haunted look that had lingered in his eyes since his escape from the plantations was finally gone, replaced by something Ayana had never seen there before: absolute peace. The knowledge that his wife had risked everything to save him, that she had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, had healed something deep inside him. He no longer saw himself as a victim, as someone who had to constantly look over his shoulder for pursuers. He was free, truly free, for the first time in his life. "Tell me again what happened after I left," he said, settling back against a sun-warmed boulder. Ayana smiled. This was the 4th time he had asked for the story, and she suspected it wouldn't be the last. There was something in his voice when he asked, not just curiosity, but a kind of wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe what had happened. "Wade made it to the settlement at Mesilla," she began, settling beside him on the warm stone. "He rode his horse nearly to death getting there, arrived just after dawn, with his clothes torn and his eyes wild with terror. He told everyone who would listen about the Apache witch who killed 5 men with magic stones. The story had spread like wildfire through the settlement. Wade had burst into the first saloon he found, babbling about invisible attackers and stones that flew through the darkness like bullets. Most of the patrons had dismissed him as drunk or mad, but a few had listened with growing unease. And they believed him? Some did. Others thought he was drunk or mad with desert fever. But word spread quickly. By the time the territorial marshal organized a posse to investigate, half the slave hunters in New Mexico had already packed up and headed back to Texas. The psychological effect had been immediate and devastating. Slave hunting was a business that depended on confidence and superior firepower. The idea that a lone Apache woman could systematically destroy an entire hunting party was more than most men could accept. It challenged their fundamental assumptions about their own superiority, their control over the situation. Quana laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed off the canyon walls. "Good. Let them run. Let them all run." The marshal found the camp. Ayana continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Found the bodies. Found the evidence. Morrison's rifle was still loaded. He never got a shot off. Briggs had emptied his weapon into empty air. The only wounds on any of them were from stones. The investigation had been thorough, but ultimately futile. The marshal was an experienced lawman who had seen his share of violence, but this was unlike anything in his experience. The precision of the kills, the surgical accuracy of the wounds, the complete absence of any defensive fire, it all pointed to something beyond normal human capability. What did the marshal conclude? That Wade was telling the truth. That there really was an Apache woman out there who could kill armed men with a sling. The story has already reached Santa Fe, and from there it will spread to every trading post and settlement from California to the Mississippi. The implications were staggering. The American Southwest was a vast territory where news traveled slowly and often became distorted in the telling. But this story had a power that transcended normal gossip. It spoke to primal fears and ancient truths, to the understanding that the land itself might rise up against those who violated its sacred laws. Quana was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. They'll send soldiers. The army won't tolerate this kind of resistance. It was a sobering thought. The United States military was already engaged in a campaign to pacify the Apache tribes, to force them onto reservations where they could be controlled and monitored. The story of Ayana's victory would be seen as a direct challenge to American authority, a provocation that demanded response. Let them come. Ayana's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. This is our land, Quana, our mountains, our deserts, our canyons. We know every stone, every shadow, every hiding place. If they want to hunt us, they'll learn what Morrison learned. And if they bring too many soldiers, if they bring cannons and cavalry. The question hung in the air between them. Ayana knew that her victory, however complete, was just the beginning of a larger struggle. The white man's hunger for land and resources was insatiable, and they would not be deterred by the death of a few slave hunters. Ayana looked down at the camp, at the people she had sworn to protect. Then we'll disappear into the deep places, the sacred places where white men fear to go. We'll become legends ourselves, stories told around their fires to frighten their children. We'll be the shadows that move in the night, the stones that fall from empty sky. As if summoned by her words, her grandfather Nalnish appeared on the ridge behind them, moving with his characteristic silence. The old warrior's face was grave, but there was pride in his eyes as he looked at his granddaughter. He had heard the full story from the scouts who had investigated the scene, and he understood the magnitude of what she had accomplished. "The runners have returned from the south," he said without preamble. "The story has reached the Chiricahua, the Mescalero, even the Jicarilla. They're calling you Tse-nah-es-tizhn, she who kills with stones." Ayana felt a chill run down her spine. Among the Apache, names had power. To be given a war name by the other bands was to be marked by destiny itself, to be recognized as something more than human. It was an honor that carried tremendous responsibility. The name would spread beyond the Apache tribes, she knew. It would be whispered in trading posts and army forts, spoken with fear and respect by those who understood its significance. She was no longer just Ayana, the young woman with the deadly sling. She was becoming something larger, more symbolic, a representation of Apache resistance itself. "There's more," Nalnish continued, settling onto a nearby rock. 3 different slave-hunting parties have turned back rather than enter Apache territory. The traders in Santa Fe are complaining that their supply of Indian labor has dried up completely. The economic impact was already being felt. The slave trade had been a lucrative business for many frontier entrepreneurs, providing cheap labor for mines and ranches throughout the territory. But fear was bad for business, and the story of the Apache woman who killed with stones was spreading faster than any merchant could travel. "Good," Quana said fiercely. "Let them complain. Let them find honest work for honest wages." Nalnish studied the younger man with approval. "You speak like an Apache now, Shie. The plantation scars on your back have not marked your spirit." It was true. The transformation in Quana had been remarkable to witness. The broken, desperate man who had stumbled into their camp 2 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who carried himself with the quiet confidence of a true warrior. He had found not just freedom among the Apache, but identity, purpose, belonging. "My spirit belongs to this woman," Quana replied, taking Ayana's hand. "And through her, to this land. I am Apache now, in all the ways that matter." The old warrior nodded slowly. "Then you understand what must come next." Ayana looked up sharply. What do you mean, Shiche? The story is spreading, granddaughter. But stories change in the telling. Already some say you killed 12 men. Others claim you can throw stones through solid rock, or that you can become invisible at will. The legend is growing beyond the truth. It was inevitable, Ayana supposed. Stories had a life of their own, growing and changing as they passed from mouth to mouth. The truth of what had happened in that canyon would soon be buried beneath layers of myth and superstition. And that's bad? Not bad. Necessary. Nalnish settled onto a nearby rock, his weathered hands folded over his walking stick. For too long, our people have been seen as victims, hunted, captured, sold like animals. But now there is a new story. Now there is a tale of an Apache woman who turned the tables, who made the hunters into the hunted. He gestured toward the camp below, where people moved about their daily tasks with a new sense of purpose and pride. Look at them, Ayana. Look at how they hold their heads high. Look at the pride in their eyes. They are no longer just survivors. They are the people of Tse-nah-es-tizhn, the woman who kills with stones. The responsibility was overwhelming. These people were looking to her not just as a protector, but as a symbol of hope, a proof that resistance was possible. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her like a physical thing. Ayana felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. You want me to become the legend, to live up to the stories they're telling. I want you to become what our people need you to be, Nalnish said gently, a symbol, a reminder that we are not helpless, that we will not go quietly into the darkness the white man has planned for us. The old warrior's words carried the weight of prophecy. He had lived through decades of conflict, had seen his people gradually pushed back into smaller and smaller territories. He understood that this was about more than one woman's quest for vengeance. This was about the survival of a way of life, about preserving something sacred in the face of overwhelming odds. And if I fail, if I'm killed or captured, then you will die as an Apache warrior should die, fighting for your people, your land, your freedom, and the story will live on, inspiring others to take up the fight. Quana squeezed her hand. You won't be alone in this. Whatever comes, we face it together. The promise meant everything to her. She had been prepared to face this burden alone, but knowing that Quana would stand beside her made it bearable. Together, they could become something greater than either could be alone. A symbol of love, triumphant, of justice served, of the power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle. Ayana looked out over the vast expanse of desert and mountains that stretched to the horizon. This was the land of her birth, the place where her ancestors had lived and died for countless generations. It was worth fighting for. It was worth dying for. But more than that, it was worth living for. Tell me about the other stories, she said finally. The ones that are spreading with mine. Nalnish smiled, understanding that she was beginning to see the bigger picture. Now you're thinking like a war leader. Yes, there are other stories. A Navajo shepherd who led an entire cavalry patrol into quicksand. A Comanche woman who poisoned a trading post full of slave dealers. A Seminole chief who burned 3 plantations in a single night. The pattern was clear. Across the continent, native peoples were beginning to fight back, to resist the encroachment of white civilization in ways that captured the imagination. These stories were spreading like wildfire, inspiring others to take action, to refuse to accept their fate passively. Are they true? Some are, others are, inspired by truth, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that our people are no longer just victims in the stories white men tell about themselves. We are becoming the heroes of our own tales. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Ayana felt something shift inside her. The frightened young woman who had set out to rescue her husband was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. She was no longer just Ayana, the Apache girl with the deadly sling. She was Tse-nah-es-tizhn, she who kills with stones. She was legend made flesh, hope given form, resistance incarnate. And she was just getting started. "Shiche," she said, rising to her feet. "Send word to the other bands. Tell them that Tse-nah-es-tizhn calls for a gathering. It's time to stop running. It's time to stop hiding." And then Ayana picked up her sling, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. Somewhere out there, Wade was probably still running, still telling his story of the Apache witch who had destroyed his companions with magic stones. Let him run, let him tell his tale to anyone who would listen, because for every person who heard that story and felt fear, there would be another who heard it and felt hope. And hope, Ayana had learned, was the most dangerous weapon of all. "Then we remind the world that this is Apache land," she said, "and that some things are worth fighting for." The legend of Tse-nah-es-tizhn had begun with 6 stones and 5 dead men, but it would not end there. It would grow and spread like wildfire across the desert, inspiring resistance wherever people yearned to be free. And at its heart would always be the truth that had started it all, the love of one woman for one man, and her refusal to let that love be destroyed by those who saw human beings as property. In the end, that was the most powerful legend of all. The story of Ayana, Tse-nah-es-tizhn, she who kills with stones, reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from armies or governments, but from individuals who refuse to accept injustice. Her legend spread across the American Southwest, inspiring countless others to resist oppression and fight for their freedom. If this incredible story of love, courage, and resistance moved you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more amazing historical tales, and share this story with others who need to hear about the power of one person to change the world. What other legendary figures from history would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below.